This is the Latin News Podcast. I'm Richard McCall here in Bogota, Colombia, your host. Our very special guest is on the line from Los Angeles, none other than Susana Hecht. She is a professor at the Lustin School of Public Affairs, the director of the Brazil Center at UCLA, professor of Graduate Institute for International Development in the Department of History and Politics at Geneva, and she's at the Institute of Environmental and Sustainability at UCLA. So with that very impressive CV or resume, we're going to be talking about deforestation. Deforestation, obviously, largely in the Amazon, because when you think about it, the 9 countries that have Amazonian frontiers and include the Amazon, well, what a huge issue to be addressing. So, Professor Susana, thank you so much for coming on the Latin News Podcast.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm talking to you from climate-battered California, Southern California. My road is closed from landslides, so just to keep things in proportion, climate change is pretty generalized these days, even among places that view themselves as immune from it. So let me just jump right in here. I think that Amazonia suffers a little bit from what I always call the green blob problem, which is you see it on a map and it's a big green blob. So what we're going to try and do in this podcast, and we don't have very much time, is to go through some of the big questions and big dynamics. There's a lot of data that we're going to be referring to, but we're going to have Richard put this on the Latin News website, because otherwise I'll be doing what everybody does on a Zoom, which is, can you see my screen? And too much detail. So if you want to go into the sort of weeds and empirics on this, we'll make sure that this material is available. But in the time we have, we can't possibly do a detailed discussion of all the numbers. But we'll be talking about trends, and you can find the information on the Latin News website. First of all, while we'll be talking about Pan-Amazonia, which means all of Amazonia. So if you think about the continent of South America, the big bulge is mostly Amazonia. So even though there's 9 countries of the 13 South American countries, most of them have Amazonian territory. And while most of the Amazon biome might be found in, or what's considered the sort of big Amazonian biome, a lot of these countries, I'll go through them for you. This is I'm a geographer, so I have to do these on tests all the time. But think of Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and then Brazil, of course, and then the Guyana countries, which everybody forgets about because they're sort of more Caribbean. I always refer to it as the Caribbean Amazon, but it's British Guyana, which is currently under threat from Venezuela for its territory. Suriname, which used to be called Dutch Guyana, and the Department of French Guyana, we're talking about it as a country, but it never really decolonized. It's still a part of France. So we're looking at a huge area. It's larger than the continental United States. It's not just one big green blob. There are lots of different kinds of things. But what's important to realize is this, and I'm going to go for just a little historical note here because I think it's important, which is Amazonia itself used to be an independent colony when in the colonial period. It was part of the Portuguese empire when Portugal had an empire. In 1822, basically with the complete collapse of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, the Spanish holdings became republics. And instead of 2 Portuguese-speaking colonies, what happened was that Amazonia, which at the time was called the North, was given into the Brazilian monarchy. So it became part of a kind of internal Brazilian colonialism and never actually went through this process of liberation and individual sovereignty that you saw elsewhere. I think it's important to keep this in mind because many people refer to Amazonia as kind of an internal colony. It's important to realize, even though we go, oh, most of the stuff is most of Amazonia is in Brazil, but in the countries, a lot of their area, in fact, is in the Amazon biome. And that's especially true in the Guyanas, where 90% of their sovereign territories are actually in the biome. So once you start to move it away from the green blob into these different sovereignties, there's a bunch of different things that kind of come up. So one of the things is, of course, that we have, you might see, there's been a lot of discussions about Amazonian deforestation for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that you might want to think about is also that Amazonia is kind of different from the temperate zone. When we think of forests, we have our, our forests, and they're just not nearly as diverse as what you see in Amazonia. And also that in that green blob, there's different kinds of forests all over the place. In the same way that you can think of different forests in the United States or different kinds of forests in Europe, but the point is here that these are hyper biodiverse. About 10 or probably more percent of global biodiversity, all the different kinds of species are found there. So that and they're in complex relationship to each other. So usually if I were cutting down a forest here in Southern California, my little oak woodland here, I'll get an oak woodland pretty much back. If you cut down an Amazonian forest, you miss the possibility of actually getting that same forest back. So it's important to realize that when we cut things down there, you're not necessarily getting the same thing back. So that's one thing that's important in terms of how you might think of structuring or restructuring a forest for landscape recovery or rewilding, as is popularly discussed. So that's one thing. It's really diverse. The second thing is that it operates a lot in the global climate. And I think people, get so used to, well, there's deforestation and then there's climate problems. But the thing is this, Amazonia is considered to be one of this kind of key points about global climate. And the reason is that let me just step back a second. It's considered one of the, depending on who you're reading, top 5 or top 7 tipping points in the global climate. What are the other ones? Oh, things like Antarctica or the Greenland ice sheet. Sometimes areas, permafrost areas are included, but also the big tipping points associated with oceanic atmospheric currents like El Nino. So the thing about all the other tipping points that I think is really important to emphasize and kind of gets lost in the tipping point, dare we say, blah, blah, is that Amazonia is inhabited. And it's inhabited by 40 million people. The Greenland ice sheet and Antarctica are reflecting larger, what climatologists call teleconnections. They're reflecting larger atmospheric dynamics. Larger atmospheric dynamics are affecting Amazonia, but land use change and forms of interaction with that environment are also affecting the climate. And one of the things is that Amazonia kind of creates its own rainfall and creates its own atmospheric rivers. Those of us who have been battered by atmospheric rivers recently, perhaps have a different view of atmospheric rivers. But the point is, it really affects the weather in the Andes. It affects the rest of the South American continent, and it probably has a lot of implications on the currents in the Atlantic, in the Southern Atlantic. So we're really looking at something that is really consequential when we lose it, but also that is reflecting human agency. So if it's reflecting human agency, then we have the capacity, in principle, to shift the story a little bit. So I really wanted to emphasize that because it's not just about rates of deforestation, although that's important, but rather also about that this is a big tipping point, and it is also under human control in a way. So this is, if there's any big takeaway that you get from your early morning listening, it should be this. First of all, so let's go now into the questions of rates of deforestation and what does it mean and
Very
that
good.
kind of thing. Richard, do you want to direct me in any way? Otherwise,
Well,
I'll just
I think
babble on.
before you get into this quickly, what I feel is that you're suggesting here as well, and not only the human element here, but the Amazonian deforestation is far more volatile than we think. Then, I mean, it's a global collective problem. What are we doing in terms of enforcement? But go first into the figures, and then we can think about the enforcement and regulations being enforced to try and protect and let's reduce the figures of deforestation.
Okay, so let me trot through some of these. First of all, it's important to realize that while we sort of think of deforestation as always being an upward flow, in fact, it's volatile. It goes up and down, and we'll put some graphs on the website so you can look at this, because what you can see is that at moments there will be sort of dramatic falls in deforestation. One is 1992. Of course, everybody remembers 1992, but that was when there was the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit,
Yeah.
and Brazil wanted to look good, so they really enforced low deforestation. So then you get a low deforestation, then everybody goes home and does what they do when they go home, and so it goes up, and it's volatile. Then what happens is Lula comes in 2004. By 2012, deforestation has dropped by 82%. So there's a lot of things that go on, and I'll get to those in a moment. It's not matched necessarily by the other countries. Other countries have deforestation dynamics that may reflect things like insurgency. So when you have insurgency in the Amazon, people don't go in because it's kind of dangerous to do so. And there have been quite a few insurgencies. This is part of its big history, is one of insurgency. So let me go back to Brazil quickly. So we drop it by 82%, which is really something. Now, it's important to understand that that's the Amazon basin we're talking about. There are other kinds of forests at the same time that are undergoing a kind of slaughter. And we can think of the Brazilian Cerrado, which is a kind of savanna ecosystem, which ends up being 50% deforested because it's far less regulated in terms of its clearing dynamics than Amazonia. But so we get to 2012, we have a kind of weird dynamic. I won't go into the Brazilian history of this moment, but then Jair Bolsonaro comes in. And what happens is you see an explosion in deforestation. And why is this? Because he says, go for it. We're not going to enforce the regulations. Indians shouldn't stand in the way of progress. Forests shouldn't stand in the way of progress. Don't lecture us, temperate zone, because you deforested and developed, and you want us to stay with primitives and so on. There are lots of flaws to that discourse, by the way, but in any case, I'm just repeating it as part of the sort of ideological apparatus. It's important to understand that this volatility comes from a lot of different things. And I'm going to go through them quickly because we really don't have much time. But some of them are because of specific Amazon policies, national integration, for example, or protected areas, new agrarian reform settlements. Those are all part of specifically Amazonian policies. But there can be other things. There can be sort of the role of Amazon in terms of national legitimacies, national integration and geopolitics being one. The idea of controlling insurgencies, that's been a part of Amazonian history as well. The other thing is that there can be geopolitical and regional things like the Amazon Pact, where they basically coordinate infrastructure development and sort of border agreements and so on. It's really sort of more linked to kind of performative and infrastructure. But then the other thing is that there's also a lot of competing land rights that come from overlapping histories in these regions, which gives you a kind of a land chaos, which is really one of the things that is problematic for Amazonia, so that you have several different forms and several different forms of jurisdiction working at the same time. So what that means in practice is this, that so this is like the simplest way to understand Amazonia is through this land chaos model, which is that if you want to claim land, your best bet is to clear it so that competing forms of tenure or land use go away. And what this is that for various reasons having to do with Roman law, won't go into it, it gives you the sort of squatter rights. It shows what's called effective use. And that makes getting titling or getting access and control much easier. And typically what happens in this case is you throw some cattle on it and claim it and maybe even speculate on it. But the point is that there's several policy things and regulations that can apply. They can be quite contradictory. And in that context, what you can get is a lot of land chaos. The other thing is, let's just face it, global markets. If you want to look at what are some of these drivers, we can just go into that right now.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things. There are three sort of big economies that don't actually require complete deforestation in the region, but have a lot of implications. And they have implications mainly because they also have infrastructure and they're kind of toxic. But one is, you might not be thinking about this given the Middle East and everything else, but Amazonia is, I often think of it as so what we might call Saudi Amazonia. It's got a huge sort of oil, how should we say, a kind of a oil semicircle that goes, or hydrocarbon circle that goes really from Bolivia all the way over and out into the Atlantic Ocean. So you have to understand that all of the Amazon countries are very interested in getting to oil. Even if there have been things like initiatives to keep the oil in the ground and so on, what you really want to understand is that oil is part of every Amazonian country's thinking. So if we're looking at the kinds of questions that we want to think about controlling deforestation, one of the things is, except for Colombia, all of them have said, oh no, oil exploration, petrochemical exploration, fine.
Just jump in quickly there. So we've
Sure.
got the left-wing government of Gustavo Petro, who's saying keep the oil in the ground. President Noboa in Ecuador, I suppose, due to his condition of being connected with all of the sort of, let's say, business magnates in Ecuador, has not really commented on this. Lula in Brazil, we'd kind of expect him to have a more of a an environmental policy. Venezuela, we don't even need to discuss because is it rogue? Is it failed? I mean, you can get into that. That's a whole other conversation. And of course, then Guyana is keen. Well, the Exxon state of Guyana is obviously taking advantage of there. Suriname, I suppose, has some, and others. Bolivia has some. But these governments, do they just sort of quietly ignore calls to keep oil in the ground?
Oh, not so quietly. I think that all of them view this as being an important economic development future for them.
Hmm.
This is not the time, the moment of what we might have thought of nationalization
Mm.
of these kinds of resources. And remember that most of them are looking at sort of failed industrial policies.
Hmm.
And so that a significant portion of their foreign exchange, and it comes from oil revenue. Brazil just joined OPEC, declined to not, even though there's a judgment against developing oil in the mouth of the Amazon. We'll find out. I think
Mm.
that once you see oil, and with Noboa, of course, he's in a state of emergency now because he's essentially presiding over a narco state. And in this case, he overrode a national referendum for keeping the oil in the ground.
Mm.
So, under the conditions that he can do under states of exception.
Mm.
So, it's a complicated story. But one of the things about oil is that it is not, this is the sort of oil curse, which is that it generates a lot of money and it generates it into national coffers, which of course has a certain level of corruption everywhere in these
Mm.
countries. But the other thing that it does is that it is also highly toxic and polluting in the context where you have very low regulatory capacities.
Mm.
And so these are also poisoning rivers, poisoning forests. They're flaring, they're emitting a lot of CO2, they're emitting a lot of methane. So that these are not the sort of, tightly managed oil fields that you would expect of other places, although even that is sort of open for question. But they are sort of wildly polluting. But let me go on to another big
Hmm.
polluter, which is gold mining.
Yep.
One of the things, this is there, there's something that I always call Amazon alchemy, where you take something that is actually illegally produced, you do a certification, and suddenly it becomes a
Mm.
legal commodity. So the Swiss will tell you that 95% of the gold, which most gold goes through Switzerland, they will all say, we have the
Mm.
certificates, it's legal.
Mm.
Um, Whereas actually we know, while there are some areas of gold mining that are permitted, most of it is what we would call wildcat mining. And that is essentially placer mining, dredging, and sort of riparian level mining. What's the problem there is not just the sediments that go in and ruin the rivers, because you disrupt the riverbed to get out the gold, but also that to create the amalgam, which is the gold itself,
Mm.
you need to put it in a slurry with mercury. And
Mm.
mercury is quite toxic, besides driving you crazy. The Mad Hatter, of course, is emblematic of that. This is hatters in England used to use a lot of mercury, so they were all crazy. Also, the famous Minamata, birth defect, learning
Mm.
disabilities, and so on. What happens is now you have this massive flow of mercury into the rivers, but also as you volatilize it, it's toxic to the trees, it's toxic to the forest, it's toxic to animals. So you have, and not to mention humans. So what you have is a kind of not just the problem of sort of insight pollution, of let's say the question of the sediments, but you have a sort of indirect, much more dispersed form of pollution as well. So
Mm.
this now becomes a problem. And then, of course, you may have roads going in and out. You have also a lot of this is moved on airplanes because it's small and valuable. The next thing, the next economy that I would talk about is timber extraction. Oh, let me just add one thing. Gold mining is a major employer in
Yeah.
Amazonia.
Yeah.
So one of the things is if you have a failed industrial or other kinds of policies that can't absorb labor, people will move into gold, even part-time, because it uses labor.
Yeah.
Another is timber extraction. Again, here you get a lot of infrastructure development, which also causes deforestation, informal infrastructure, which is the dominant form. And then the other thing is that this is also largely clandestine. It often goes through a sort of fake certification
Mm.
process, or the other thing people like to do is mix certified with uncertified, and then you can't tell what is what, and
Mm.
they all go out under the stamp of certification. But
Yeah.
what this does is it creates a lot of vulnerability of the forests that remain, because there's slash underneath that dries out, and it makes these all more vulnerable to fire and also other forms of deforestation.
Which of course we've been seeing of late, the huge forest
Fires.
fires that have been taking place. I thought about this and the huge forest fires and the deforestation taking place, and it made me think of the Leticia Pact of 2019, when all of these governments get together and have a nice jolly talking about what needs to be done. Are these actually effective, or are they more, let's say, performative and ceremonial, of a ceremonial value?
Oh, I think they're important ceremonially, and basically what they do is they sort of coordinate infrastructure and border management and what do you call it? Overflight regulations and so on. But in terms of actually being coordinating policy, they might, for example, say, well, we'll send firefighters over to you.
Mm.
But in reality, there isn't really very much coordination. The coordination really comes about regulation of the borders when you start to have infrastructure crossing them, as you are seeing much more widespread in a more widespread
Yeah.
way right now.
This ancillary infrastructure, it all comes in. As you said, you need to get in and out for the gold. As you said, you need a runway, or if you've got the oil, all of the construction with the oil,
Pipelines.
the pipelines. And then I was just thinking of the other possible issues. You talked about timber, you talked about oil, you talked about gold, but of course we've got cattle,
Hmm.
soy, coca in the terms of like Peru, Colombia, I think some Ecuador. Uh, what else? I mean, there's a lot of things that go on in this area.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think I was starting to talk about stuff that wasn't actually didn't really require deforestation, that land chaos
Mm.
drives a lot of the cattle development, and also as the Brazilian cattle herd has become cleaner in the sense that it doesn't carry hoof and mouth disease or other kinds of internationally prohibited diseases. And what you
Mm.
see is, and that JBS has sort of become a global monopoly, and also that the demand for meat globally has increased as global incomes have gone up. So
Mm.
what you see is both a market driver, a sort of land speculative driver, and a land claiming dynamic, and also it's subsidized.
Yeah.
So, and it's low labor. So that's the other thing, is that it doesn't require the kind of labor dynamics or skilled labor that you would otherwise need.
Mm.
This is also one of those things where in the demand for that the particularly the EU has started to put on deforestation free commodities, what you have is animals coming from a deforested farm, fattening shortly on a certified farm, going into the supply chain. So this is another part of Amazonian alchemy. Uh, Again, cattle have been transforming landscapes in the tropics since they arrived in 1500. So they have had this long kind of history in terms of transforming landscapes and ecosystems. I think also it's important to recognize that a lot of it is managed with fire. It goes in, it degrades other kinds of adjacent forests. So we start to see kind of a feedback loop of increasing fire vulnerability, especially when we get climate change with it. With soy, again, it's important to realize that this is both a market-driven and also a subsidized sector, and also that, you know, it is the world's largest. Brazil is now the largest producer of soy, and Amazonia, of course, is the largest producer of soy as well, as a consequence. So one of the things that's important to keep in mind about this is that when you start to regulate the deforestation dynamics, soy is kind of like a whack-a-mole. You can control it in one place, but then it comes up in the Argentinian Chaco or the Bolivian Chiquitano forests or in the Cerrado or even in Suriname's imaginary intense agro-industrial development so far, but they want this to happen. But the point of this is that it expands. It's largely driven by demand for animal feed. People are not eating tofu that much, even in Asia. So the demand is enormously driven by Chinese and Middle Eastern and European consumers for mainly animal feed. One of the things that's important to realize is that China is Latin America's largest trade partner. And China's footprint, China is not particularly concerned about deforestation per se. It's more concerned about its sort of market, handling its market. So we do very much see the force of international markets in the expansion of some of these things. Coca, of course, it would be another example. But let me just say one more thing about soy. Soy involves the use of a lot of chemicals, and particularly what are called emergent herbicides. So they're sprayed with these herbicides to keep weeds down so that the genetically modified soy can come up. It drifts. The thing about atmospheres and water and air is like things don't stay put in them. So you're having a lot of effects from the usual thing is glyphosate, on forests, on fisheries, on other kinds of things. And also we have pesticides. So you have to sort of think of Amazonia as not just having a problem of deforestation, but also very serious issues associated with toxics that are widespread now. So even if you have a standing forest next to a river, you may have a much more toxic atmosphere than you prefer. These questions also apply for coca. Coca, of course, has a long history, at least a 5,000-year history in Amazonia, but not as a global commodity. And of course, the commodification of this has always been associated with clandestine economies, and also a certain amount of violence and insurgency. So in order to just go quickly here, what we also have is some small farmer questions as well. My big point, though, is when we look at the economies of the Amazon countries, what we see is a very important role that Amazonia is playing in these in terms of foreign exchange, in terms of national legitimacy, and a kind of get out of jail free for countries that are either flailing states or failed states and so on, because of the importance of these resources. Well, are there alternatives? I would say that it's Amazon alchemy works here as well, which is stuff that you may have seen the article on carbon cowboys this morning, which is that there's all this offset money that people in the temperate zone pay to continue their behavior while paying tropical countries to keep their forests up, to suck up that carbon. So there's a problem of corruption in this. The value of carbon in the developed world is undervalued, while it may be overvalued in the temperate zone. And of course, there's always the argument about that there's regulatory imperialism, which is that we're supposed to cut our forests, say the tropics, and you can do whatever you want. So there's a sort of sharp debate, but there are sustainable commodities, and it's really important to think about these not only as nurturing landscapes, but also keeping peasant economies in place, because these are somewhat labor demanding and they're valuable. So one is acai, the superfood that at least as a California denizen and also often Amazonian denizen, I can report is delicious and very healthful, and it's not cheap. Cacao, we now see if you go into fancy food stores, there'll be, a discussion of different kinds of cacao from Peru, from Ecuador, from Venezuela, from Colombia as being specific, sort of like as you would imagine for different wine varieties, which is that they discuss the varieties and the features of different kinds of things. You're probably drinking more coffee from Amazonia than you might realize if you drink coffee blends. A lot of it's grown in the foothills of Amazonia. And also with climate change, you see some movement more into warmer areas, also some genetic changes in the coffee, particularly for Robusta, which does okay. It's not that delicious Arabica coffee, but it is the one that goes into most of the blends and like instant coffee. Things like Brazil nuts. You might think of these as being kind of luxury items. They all are, but on the other hand, they generate significant amounts of return in the multi-billions, not comparable to oil and soy, of course, but not nothing. And then the sort of weird things like maca. If I go into my little bodega in my neighborhood, it's got a thing that's full of little Amazonian items that are considered health food. So maca is one of them. Acai powder is another. Cacao nibs, and I could just go on, and perhaps this just reflects the manias of Southern California. But the point is that these are Amazonian commodities that are moving into large international markets. But they move into them through a kind of specialty market kind of approach. And they also produce many other things simultaneously, including the capacity to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and other livelihood elements within those systems. So those agroforestry systems are important alternatives. It's sort of the discussion of bioeconomies. What about medicines and other kinds of things based on indigenous forms of knowledge? And there's another question there about biopiracy. We won't have time to go into it. But the point is that it's a really complex place. There are alternatives. Every one of those alternatives has a complexity around it and also a big debate. But the other thing is that the drivers of deforestation are very powerful and very structurally embedded, and also have basically oligarchic economies around them, a fair amount of corruption. And right now, if we think about governance in all of those 9 countries, we're looking at flailing states, failing states, narco states, and petrostates. And each of those have serious problems. But one of the things I know about Amazonia is that it can always surprise you. And to quote my favorite Brazilian author, Euclides da Cunha, who spent a lot of time in Amazonia, who wrote about its history, said, such is the river, such is its history, always turbulent, always insurgent. And that's it for me.
Well, I honestly, flailing and failing and narco and petro, it doesn't sound very positive, but you have talked us through some of the positive natures that deforestation does appear. As you say, it's volatile, but it goes up and down. We need to ask, and we need to, you finish on that wonderful, wonderful quote, But let's ask one final question of you here. I mean, you get into this, obviously the illegality of everything, the money laundering that must go on. You've talked about the positive side of, let's say, the bio market of cacao, acai, coffee, maca, Brazil nuts. Um, Obviously, these do not pull up the shortfall from petroleum, soy, and beyond cattle and timber. What, as a final, as a closing commentary here, overall, what role is the developed world playing in trying to mitigate deforestation in this region?
Well, it operates mostly through markets and less through
Mm,
regulation. There have been a lot of activities to come and try and help monitor deforestation better, to help support enforcement of regulations better. So that, but it's a place that's touchy because of the sovereignty issues that are
mm,
associated with trying to control this. So this is why it works in a kind of different way, to mainly try and ramp up the local and national capacities for implementing the regulations that they already have.
mm,
The other thing is uh, the dynamic the developed world has a lot to say about this, but in essence, soybean is mainly consumed, is extracted, is consumed mostly in Southeast, in China, in Southeast Asia, and in the Middle Eastern world. And those areas are not particularly interested in controlling deforestation. They're interested in cheap commodities.
mm,
So the footprint of these kinds of consumption patterns may be sort of limited in their own national territories, but they have this very broad international thing. And we can't just assume that just because Europeans and Americans prefer not to have a lot of deforestation, that that's a universally shared point of view.
mm,
The question of increasing consumption of meat and other kinds of living animals involves using these kinds of products. So one of the things is, of course, changing diets, but
mm,
at a moment in which you have the kind of promotion of eating animal protein as a signifier of class, it's very difficult to say, well, and go back to lentils, you know.
yeah.
So there's that. The other thing is California consumes a third of the oil of Ecuador.
Mm,
So one of the things is decarbonizing some of these systems, but of course it's always whack-a-mole
yeah.
because there's nickel, there's lithium, there's a lot aluminum
Mm,
that is coming out of Amazonia, not the lithium, but aluminum and nickel and
mm,
other sort of rare earths that are used in decarbonization. And those are requiring infrastructure to go in and get it out. And so while your aluminum mine might not take over the whole world, the energy that it needs requires the development of hydropower systems that are very disruptive of those rivers. And most of the energy is consumed not by the population at large, but by the aluminum industry, which is sending out basically ingots, but not any
mm,
sort of uh, um, highly developed products. So
mm,
the problem that you have with sort of reducing carbon emissions, let's say from the transportation sector, has implications for, because everything comes from somewhere.
mm,
So what you then have are problems associated with other forms of mineral wealth that come out of these areas. The other thing is, you know, maybe ease up on the gold, but that's if you're only thinking about gold as jewelry and not as a hedge for volatility in global markets. And it's going at something like $2,200 an ounce, so it's quite a valuable little commodity out there. In a situation in which we have a lot of volatility, both because of the Ukrainian wars, because of, and the Middle East in general, but other areas of uncertainty, shall we say. So there's a lot of things that Amazonia does which hedges transitions. And it's difficult to, as I say, with Amazonia, you're always playing whack-a-mole. It's like, if you don't control one thing here, but in that same way, we've seen deforestation go up, we've seen it go down. So it is vulnerable, it is amenable to human agency.
I think, I mean, we could listen to you for hours and hours. Your knowledge seems to be bottomless. But one thing I'm taking from this conversation, and in a minute I'll thank you, but it's the serious economic dependency from all of these countries, from all of these products that we've mentioned. So I think we can bring this to an end here and just say, listen, from the Latin News podcast and myself, Richard McCall here in Bogota, Professor Susanna Hecht, the professor of the Lustin School of Public Affairs, also director of the Brazil Center at UCLA, professor of Graduate Institute for International Development in the Department of History and Politics in Geneva, professor of the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, author of multiple articles and books. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and just scratching the surface, I think, of your wealth of knowledge on this topic.
Thank you so much, Richard. And anytime you want to chat about the Amazon, I'm always available.
I hope we get you back on again to discuss this, but hopefully for good news. When we have something to say, listen, it's really dropped. Everyone stopped eating beef. We want more.
Well, it did drop by 50% in Brazil last year. So, as I say, it's a volatile thing. So
Yes.
we'll, as I always like to say these days, we'll find out.
We'll find out. Well, thank you again. Thank you from all of us here at the Latin News Podcast. I've been Richard McCall talking to Professor Susanna Hecht about many of the complexities revolving around deforestation in the Amazon. I know you've enjoyed it. Subscribe, share, and make sure you tune in, because we'll be back in a fortnight with further issues and further conversations with experts from the Latin America region. Thank you and goodbye.